My name is Prakash Ishwar, and together with my colleague and fellow co-chair Dino Christensen, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to the first ever BU Data Science Day, or BUDS Day as we like to call it. When Azure tasked us with putting together this event, we knew that there were a number of groups in BU engaged in data science, but we didn't anticipate the diversity of research across BU when we started putting this together. So we didn't have difficulty identifying potential speakers, but we had to work very hard to put together a program which could not only showcase the diversity, but also demonstrate that there exists a nexus of themes which cut across this diversity. And you may notice that no two speakers in any panel are from the same department. So we view BUDS Day as an experiment, ultimately. So we want to start a dialogue, which we hope will lead to the growth of a vibrant data science community, one which would advance data science through interdisciplinary research collaboration. And it's also our hope that this won't be the last of the BUDS Day. That BUDS Day would blossom into a recurring event, and that every one of you who is interested and engaged in data science at BU will get the opportunity to present and share your research with the BU community. So on that note, I'd like to invite the person who conceived the idea of BUDS Day to share his thoughts. Azur Bestavros, Professor of Computer Science and the founding director of the Hariri Institute for Computing.
Thank you, Prakash. Thank you, Dino, for taking on this. I think this is credit I don't deserve. I think the idea came from junior faculty fellows at the Institute and others who said, we need to know about what else is at BU. Data science seems to be sort of this great word, but who else? So thank you for putting this together. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. When I asked a couple of days ago, my wonderful staff, Katie and Linda, how many people registered? I thought maybe 80, maybe 90, and they told me 266. And this is BU. I was shocked. It says, really? This is the biggest thing we've ever done then? So it is. And, being a data science, said, well, why don't you put it on a world cloud? Well, here's the word cloud that came out. Lots of departments, lots of disciplines. But let me ask you, so who do you think is the largest group in this room, or who registered? Looks like something about engineering, maybe computer, physics. What do you think? All right, so here's another diagram. Yeah, so this is by department. Actually, the physics and math and stats are tied. And then sort of comes the computer science and engineering, et cetera. So actually, I saw this and said, this is interesting. How you visualize data makes a big difference. If you look at this as engineering, but it really, lots of departments have engineering in them, so the word engineering is big, but not the discipline. So something about the diversity of this. 66 different disciplines have registered. Why? Why are we here? Why this diversity? Well, maybe, I don't know, you have, maybe it's about the whole sexiest job in the 21st century. Maybe it's about you're going to make a ton of money. Well, maybe it's about the data that's coming, at us, and we don't know how to stop it. We don't know what to do with it. We are actually swimming in it. We are drowning in it. Maybe many of you are here to figure out a way so that you can float. Maybe. But I think actually there is another reason. And the reason is that data science has become basically the common language of all disciplines. Tell me one discipline where, maybe there are a few still, but data science has become the language, the common language of science and of engineering and of social science and of professional disciplines. Why? Well, every one of the disciplines, actually over hundreds of years, we keep developing deeper and deeper and deeper vocabulary and models, which serve one purpose, in my opinion. Well, certainly we advance knowledge, but also it builds a wall, because then it's hard for me to understand, somebody who's really a huge scholar in physics, what they're talking about. It would take me a year to do that. However, when they start using tools I'm using, when they start talking things like machine learning and this algorithm and that cluster and that tool that's out there, all of this Hadoop, all these wonderful things, all of a sudden, the barriers go down. At least we can talk. At least we can all be in the same room. At least we can share how we use these methods differently. So I do think this is really the reason, and it's exciting to see it. Data science really touches and enables tons of disciplines. I just put a bunch of here, and just to make sure, I had one there that says disciplinary and domain knowledge, just because I want to make sure that I'm not missing anybody. So if you don't see a word there you like, just make sure that you are there, okay? It does that. It starts with getting the data, cleaning the data, scraping the data, making sure it's just in the right thing. Now you have to sort of make sure things are at scale, because spreadsheets are not going to work anymore. So we need to do things related to that. And then we need to sort of worry about security and privacy. Data is a valuable asset. And then we have to worry about doing the analytics. Really, why we do all of this at the end is to come up with what's in it and understand it. And then we have to subject that to the discipline. Does it make sense? Does it stand the test of our domain knowledge? And finally, you have to communicate this in very different ways. So with that, I want to say that as data science is in the middle of everything, so does the Hariri Institute. I just want to put a plug for the Hariri Institute. We are really the place at BU where we believe this is the crossroad for disciplines because of that, because computing and because of data science have become a common language. And there is no other place on campus where you can get this diversity of disciplines. So I hope you connect with us. I hope you check the Hariri Institute. I hope you register for our mailing list. It's really a wonderful community, and this is proof that it is growing and thriving as well. We do a lot more. This event here is one of the things we do to just promote and nurture the community, but we have specific projects and other things. Again, I invite you to take a look at that. And with that, I'll just stop here and ask Dino to tell us a little bit about the program. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Azur. Greetings all. I'm Dino Christensen. As Prakash mentioned, Prakash and I will be serving as MCs for the day, kind of shepherding us from one session to the other. To that end, we have an exciting schedule that I would like to quickly draw your attention to before moving on to the first panel. We're going to have 3 lightning session panels that will include 4 10-minute back-to-back lightning talks, followed by a 20-minute question and answer session. The first session was bundled loosely around the topic of vision. The second, networks. The third, health markets and policy. As Prakash mentioned, all of these were intentionally made interdisciplinary, so don't let the panel titles fool you or scare you. As you can see, the day is also peppered with plenty of breaks so that we remain well caffeinated. Lunch will also be provided right here and coupled with the student poster session. That is, during the lunch break, we strongly encourage you to move out into the atrium and visit the terrific student posters we have here today. Wander around, ask the students questions, keep them on their toes, really engage and support the next generation of data scientists here at BU. Following lunch, we're going to have our third lightning session. More caffeine, of course. 2 keynote addresses, the first by Jennifer Listgarten, a senior researcher at Microsoft, and the second by Alex Vespignani, who is the Sternberg Family Distinguished University Professor in the Department of Physics at Northeastern University. Following the last keynote, we will encourage all of you to stay right here for a bit, continue to network with the speakers and your fellow audience members, and enjoy some appetizers and libations courtesy of the Hariri Institute. As a reminder, before we jump into these first session of talks, both the lightning panels as well as the keynotes should be uninterrupted. That is, we're requesting that all of you save all of your questions for the speakers until the Q&A session at the end. We've built in plenty of time to get to all your questions, and we'd like it so that the speakers have time to finish their prepared slides before we interrupt them with questions. We've even assigned a fearless comrade here in the front row to serve as a timekeeper for us and for the speakers, and she'll be holding up cards for the speakers throughout the panels. Okay, so that's our schedule for today. Linda reminded me that we do have hard copies of the schedule for those of you who would like them. It doesn't seem like many people pick them up. If you would like them, Linda's wandering around and we'll pass them out. Right. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to bring up the first lightning session moderator, who will introduce the panelists and call on the audience during question and answer session. As moderator of our first panel, we're grateful and honored to have Josef Conrad, Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering. Please join me in welcoming Professor Conrad.
Thank you, Dino. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to chair this panel. So the panel is on vision, and we have 4 talks, and they are kind of related all to vision in different ways, from trying to understand how our vision works to really how we appreciate external world through vision. An example is art. And 2 talks are going to be on how we're going to try to mimic our vision by computer. And that's not an easy task, and many of you probably have tried to do that. And computers are really stupid. And we have to teach them how to think like we do, and it's not an easy task, and we're going to hear a little bit about that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker. We have Professor Jody Cranston from the Department of History of Art and Architecture from the College of Art and Sciences. And she's going to tell us about small data rather than big data. Bigger isn't always better, small data in the humanities. Please welcome the speaker.
Good morning. I just want to thank Dino and Prakash for including me in today's session. I think I'm the lone humanist, so I have to represent the group, right? Oh no, I see. There's some others who are here. So today, what I wanted to just briefly address is a kind of counterpoint to this kind of hubbub around big data, and make a kind of case for small data, which is what involves many of these humanities projects. So in general, humanities scholars tend to take delight in the small. We also try and keep ourselves away from the larger world, secreting ourselves in our caves of study. And most scholars in the humanities fear big data because it involves technology, something that scares us, but of course is encouraging to you. It's plagued with unknowns, which of course is very hard to represent within data sets. And not many research projects have big scale data. They aren't appealing in many ways to data scientists because the projects themselves aren't seen as advancing projects in data science. And as you can see, this cartoon really represents, I think, how many people in our field feel. In art history specifically, we spend a lot of time looking, talking, and interpreting. We essentially study the human contribution of these artworks to the world. And in many ways, that relies on a kind of individual experience. Someone looking at the artwork, talking about it, interpreting it, contextualizing it, thinking about it. And so there are very few aspects of art history, at least, that can be in many ways channeled into fields of data. But that doesn't mean that this discipline is without data, as the case for English or for history or other humanities disciplines, that is without information that is, although unique to each object, can be categorized across multiple objects. In the field of art history, I've found that one of those areas where one can collect, find, and categorize data is around the places in which these objects have moved, right? Recognizing the mobility of artworks and in many ways trying to figure out ways in which we can think about information that can be gleaned from that movement. Every object, every artwork has a history, even though we all tend to see these artworks like the Mona Lisa just on museum walls, where their lives are not given any kind of animation or context for us or to us. It's one of the reasons why I think audio guides are so popular, because we don't have much information about this picture. So when we ask the question, how did this painting, the Mona Lisa, find its way into the Louvre, we can open up a huge world to visitors. And this is just steps in a process. This question around the mobility of objects, the lives of objects, is something that is of great interest to me, and actually spawned a project which is now a web application called Mapping Titian. But what I really wanted to talk about is what exactly you can experience by animating, by visualizing this data that collects around these objects. So in the case of the Mona Lisa, you might not know that it was actually moving throughout Europe. It was on Napoleon's bedroom wall for a short time, which brings a whole new wrinkle to understanding the Mona Lisa. It was stolen by an Italian around the time of World War I, when World War I was about to begin. It tells us a lot about just how much these artworks have seen. This is something that I explored in the artworks by one specific artist, Titian, who's a 16th century Venetian painter, who was one of the first artists who actually had a kind of international reputation. So from the very beginning, his artworks have a mobility that others prior to this had not had. So when we look at that provenance information, which is the word that in art history we give to tracking where something was and when, we can find that this can be visualized in a number of different ways. And I chose geographic mapping, which would include both static maps as well as animated timeline maps to show that movement over time. The data collected, this is just a little shot of the spreadsheet, it's all from printed provenance catalogs, which I know for this audience, you're probably thinking this could be an easy data grab, because one should be able to access all this information, but they're all in printed catalogs. So it involves a lot of collecting this information and putting it in an Excel spreadsheet. It's a really basic collection, as you can see. And it leads to really interesting data analysis, even just in using Excel, which here we have some examples of what one can conclude. In this particular case, I just am reducing this spreadsheet down to basic kinds of bar graphs and pie charts to show you just where the major patrons were, who they were, where Titian's artworks traveled over time. And this tells us a lot about not only artworks at this time, but it has, I think, entry points to multiple other disciplines, ranging from thinking about ways in which politics did or didn't impact artworks. Someone who is studying public health could be interested in how disease might affect the way in which these artworks are collected or the ways in which they circulate. So that this small data ends up having a lot of implications for disciplines well outside of my own. And I think that many other people in this room could come up with really interesting ways of using this information. But I don't think in terms of the computational sciences, it actually presents a lot of challenges in terms of how to visualize it. It's just that in the humanities, we are not able to think in those terms. And so we really rely on all of you to help us think of ways to make this information usable and of interest to people outside of our tiny little worlds. In my case, I just worked on this mapping because I personally felt like by seeing the movement visualized in these maps, and here I'm showing you a painting from the MFA that you can go see later this weekend if you want, the St. Catherine of Alexandria, and just showing you all the movements. It's blocking out its final resting place in Boston, but showing you all of the movements of that artwork and making us ask questions about how close were cities in Europe at the time, right? Maybe in artistic terms, Spain, for example, is much more influential on Venetian art than Italy itself. These raise a lot of questions about how to redraw some of our traditional boundaries of disciplines as well as basic boundaries of geography. So this data might be small, but the interdisciplinary reach is potentially big. So relating back to what I said before, you could think about how the movements of artworks are affected by disease, by natural disasters, by population changes, by economic crises, political events, or even by one person. And we could talk about Napoleon or Hitler or others who have an enormous impact on the movement of these artworks. So how do these artworks actually affect history? And that's something that we oftentimes don't think about. We oftentimes think about history affecting cultural production, but it could easily be the other way around. So recognizing the potentially wide applicability of small data in the humanities actually helps to strengthen the human that underpins all humanities research. And for this group, humanities research might not be pushing the boundaries of data science, but with new data-driven visualizations of the kind that I can't even imagine, but you can, I hope that small can be the new big. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. And now, please hold all your questions to the end. Now we'll have the second presentation by Professor Margaret Boettke from the Computer Science Department on image and video computing for data science. Margaret.
Good morning. So I will talk about big data, but I'm going to try to connect back to your art project at the end of my talk. So where do we have an explosion of images and videos? Well, on the internet. If you go to something like internetlifestats.com, let me see if I can actually have you see this. I did practice this, but where is my, no, there's too many other things going on here. Where is it? Oh, there it is. All right, yeah. So we'll move that in. So you get to see it? Yeah. So there's, now of course I can't really manipulate this. No, it's not going to work. I'm just going to show you the. I'm just going to show you the fixed numbers. I was going to show you the count up of images that are being uploaded on the internet. In 1 second, you get thousands of images. In one day, the day I prepared the presentation, there were about 60 million photos uploaded to Flickr and 7 billion videos watched on YouTube. Facebook users, we have about 1.5 billion. So I wanted to ask you, have you uploaded an image or a video on the internet in the last month? So why don't you raise your hands? Let us, yeah, if you look around, almost everybody. Now, what's happening to these images and videos? Are you ever going to go back and look at them? I got myself a new iPhone for the holidays, and the one thing that I was most concerned about when I got this new phone was that my personal photos and videos get transferred properly. And so I wanted to have that access, even if I probably don't look at these photos or images very often. Although there's one video in here from my 5-year-old niece where she's running around singing with, you know, belting out with this Broadway voice about her experience in life. And I want that video 10 years from now when she's a teenager, a 15-year-old, all self-conscious, and I want to show her how free and open she was as a 5-year-old. So will I be able to find that video in 10 years? How easy it is for me to access it? Computer vision isn't really quite there yet in interpreting content of video and images automatically just based on pixel values. What we rely on are tags that have text that describes the image. So here's some HTML that would incorporate these tags. And I want to ask you again, when you upload images, create web pages, do you ever think of people who are visually impaired and put the tag in? People remember that? Who remembers it? All right, not too many hands. So I'm guilty of that too. I often forget. But screen readers for people who are blind rely on these text tags to tell people what's actually on a web page. And that helps people to live independent lives. So they need to be able to know what medications they're taking, or if they live in an apartment by themselves and they want to set the temperature. So what they can do nowadays is they can take a photo of the temperature control, upload it to the internet, and then there's some friendly person somewhere in the world who's going to type in back to them, oh, this is your temperature setting, all right? And I'm sure you wouldn't guess the images that are most regularly uploaded on the internet. It's actually a pregnancy test. So people don't want to show results of a pregnancy test to friends and family until they know what the results are. So they go and ask anonymous people out there to help them. Other communities that are not being served yet are people in the Arabic world who are visually impaired. So one of my, a postdoc of mine, Rana El-Anwar, started a project to analyze images with Arabic text that she got from all kinds of books published in Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and she's designing a machine learning system that would help analyze the document layout of these images and help it feed into an optical character recognition program that would then enable speech out of text. All right, so there's when you do a machine learning, design a machine learning system, you need a lot of training data. So we need tens of thousands of images that are annotated, and annotating them by hand is very time consuming. So again, we reach out to the crowd and have people help us annotate these. Same in this project. This was a joint project with Stan Sklarov. His student Zhang published a paper on salient object recognition. So the idea here is you want to find out how many salient objects are in your images, and the goal is to be able to then figure out how we can do object recognition and figure out what's actually in the image once we know how many things are in there that we need to worry about. So people can do that very easily. You can see that there are 3 penguins in one of these images. Our system was a convolutional neural net, CNN, used some deep learning here. We're able to get almost 70% correct recognition. It's much easier to tell if there's one object or no salient object in an image, but the more objects there are, the harder it becomes. What you see in this beautiful picture, by the way, is a visualization of the grouping that this deep neural net was doing in one of its layers. So the colors connect to the number of objects that it was finding. So it was self-organizing it from our training process. And again, the training was done using crowdsourcing. Now I want to show you a video. We are not only working with single images, but also videos here. We want to understand where the pedestrians are. This is both from stationary and moving cameras. The idea there is, again, if you have someone who's visually impaired, trying to navigate through a pedestrian area, they would like to know what's around them. And so some of these programs that we're developing help understand what's in a scene. We also have been working with biologists. Here's a project where we are filming bats that are emerging from a cave in Texas. And what we can do is we can track these bats' flight paths in 3 dimensions and then analyze them. So the data science component there is we have hundreds of thousands of data points here for positions of the bats, tens of thousands of trajectories. And if we want to understand how these large groups of mammals interact and fly and avoid obstacles, we can look at lots and lots and lots of data. All right, and the last video in this domain that I wanted to show is on cell tracking. So we've worked with Joyce Wong in biomedical engineering on analyzing microscopy image sequences of live cells. And the computer science component here is to be able to automatically find the location of the cells, find the shapes, so we outline these cells, and then track them through time. When the cells split, I don't know if you had a chance to see some mitosis going on, that we would know which cells split and what the lineage is. And so again, what we need to do there is to do a lot of manual annotations so that we can train our computer vision systems to do the analysis. And these annotations are extremely time consuming if you have tens of thousands of cells. And so we reach out to the internet, we go to Mechanical Turk, and we have people help us with the annotations. All right, just one quick comment about the math that's all behind this. So typically what we do is we define an objective function, some sort of cost function that we optimize, and we have constraints that describe the problem, describe the environment, and so we solve this multidimensional optimization problem. All right, I want to finish up with one last thing. As I promised, I connect back to the art world now. So here we are working with photos, and my student Masha Shugrina took a photo of a dragon boat on one of those festivals out on the Charles River, and she plugged the photo into her program that can convert the photo into a piece of art, a painting, based on her facial expression. So we started out with Masha looking very angry, and so we got a very red, angry dragon. And then we got the blues here, a sad face, and finally Masha is smiling, happy. We get this Van Gogh-style painting. And you can actually see her also in action in this video, where she's illustrating this. Is this running? Yeah. All right. This is much slower than it's supposed to be, so I'm not sure what's going on. See? Yeah, it's moving. And last thing that I wanted to mention is the exam question that I enjoyed grading most last semester for my final exam in computer vision was, I asked the students, what would you tell the Louvre if you wanted to convince them to hire you to help them out with their artwork collection as an image analysis computer scientist? And I got wonderful results that I should share with you. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, Margaret. I think you forgot your wonderful phone.
I just wanted to ask the panelists to sit at the panel table, that way we're ready for Q&A.
We have the third talk from Brian Cooley, assistant professor from electrical and computer engineering, my fellow faculty, on scalable non-parametric learning for flexible data analysis. Brian?
Thanks. Okay. Thanks very much. Yeah, so my name is Brian Koulis. I'm in electrical and computer engineering. I'm also affiliated in computer science. So I'm an algorithms guy, and I look at the core sort of mathematical problems in large-scale data analysis. The title of the talk and sort of a summary of the kind of work that I do is Scalable Non-Parametric Machine Learning. So I want to start by just describing what that means. Okay, so machine learning. Well, you know, I think many of you are probably familiar with machine learning. That's really become the language of modern data analysis. Okay, it's the set of tools that are used to make predictions from data. It's useful in lots of areas. You know, driverless cars. depend very heavily on machine learning or robotics. Okay, this robot is folding some laundry. Scalable machine learning. So what does that mean? Well, I typically try to design algorithms that are very scalable to big data, and most of my work, or a lot of my work, is focused in the computer vision area. So how do we design algorithms for processing very large amounts of visual data in order to make predictions about data? Okay. So the final piece of this is the word non-parametric, and I think that's where things get a little bit more technical. So non-parametric, well, I can describe that by sort of contrasting this with what it means to be parametric. So if you do parametric data analysis or parametric machine learning, those are things like linear regression, other linear classifiers, and other such techniques. There you have a fixed set of parameters that you're learning from some model. So for instance, in linear regression, you have a bunch of data and you want to fit that data to a hyperplane. Okay, so that hyperplane is described by some set of parameters. Okay, and then the goal is to learn those parameters. Okay, now in a non-parametric machine learning or non-parametric data analysis, the number of parameters is actually not fixed. It depends on the data. It can grow with the data. So there's a lot of examples in large-scale data analysis where we let the model complexity or the number of parameters grow. So instead of, say, learning just a hyperplane to separate two classes of data, you might need to learn something more complex. Okay? And so in cases where you don't want to fix the kind of model that you want to learn, non-parametric machine learning and non-parametric data analysis is really the way to go. The problem with non-parametric data analysis is that it's much more difficult to scale those kinds of techniques to large data. So that's really what my area of work is concerned with. Okay? So if we look at a particular example, say we're trying to do clustering. Okay, clustering is a classic machine learning problem. I give you a bunch of data points and I tell you, okay, I want to cluster these data points into some number of clusters. Okay, so if you're parametric, then I would tell you, okay, I have 3 clusters in the data, go cluster them. I might run something like a Gaussian mixture model or k-means. These are sort of classical techniques. If I'm non-parametric, that says, well, I don't know how many clusters, I don't know how many parameters there are. Okay, so in clustering, what non-parametric would mean is I have data, I don't know how many clusters there are, go find some clusters in the data, and the data will decide how many clusters there are. Okay? So the reason you would want to be non-parametric, or one reason you might want to be non-parametric in this kind of application, in clustering, suppose I'm trying to track how clusters are evolving over time. Okay, so I have some, think about an application like I have a social network and I'm trying to track how the communities are evolving in this social network over time. Okay, or maybe I have journal articles from the journal Science from 1970 to today. I'm trying to track how communities or topics in that journal evolve over time. Okay, here's a situation where you really need to be flexible and non-parametric. You don't want to specify that at every single step along the way that there's 10 topics or 10 communities. You'd like to be able to have communities merge or die out. You really need to have a flexible model, a flexible enough model to capture those kinds of dynamics. Okay, so very briefly, I of course don't have time to get into the details, but one of the techniques I look at is something that I've been developing over the last few years called small variance asymptotics. It's a way to build scalable learning algorithms, scalable data analysis algorithms. And at a high level, what this technique does is it takes a very rich statistical model, a probabilistic model, and it builds a simpler model, which I call an asymptotic model. This idea has been applied in a lot of cases in the parametric setting, and what I've been looking at is how do we apply this idea in the non-parametric setting. Okay? So as it turns out, when you take this idea and you try to apply it, for instance, for non-parametric clustering, you end up getting very simple cost functions or very simple objectives to solve. Okay, this is one example that comes out of a particular probabilistic model for non-parametric clustering called the Chinese restaurant process. And you get simple algorithms as well that come out as well from this analysis. Okay, so if we go back to this cluster evolution model, so let's say I want to build an algorithm for evolving clusters in data. Okay, and I have a bunch of requirements for this kind of model. So I'm going to be looking at data as it's evolving over time, and from one step to the next, a cluster may die. You might resurrect an old cluster after it's ceased to exist for several time steps. The clusters themselves are moving as time goes on. We might get new clusters. So if I want to do this, one way to do it is to look at something from the statistical literature. There's something called the dependent Dirichlet process. It's a beautiful model for cluster evolution, but it's a terribly slow model. You could never possibly run this on real data, big data at all. Okay, so if you use these kinds of asymptotic techniques, you can get considerably more scalable algorithms. So, for instance, in these plots, I'm showing, that the accuracy of a faster algorithm that we look at ends up being higher than the algorithms that exist for the original probabilistic model, and the time it takes to actually do the cluster evolution analysis can be, in some cases, orders of magnitude faster. Okay, so you end up getting both higher accuracy as well as faster running times with this kind of approach. Okay, so let me give you one example. Let's see if I can. So to visualize what cluster evolution looks like, we took an animated film, and what we're going to do is we're going to cluster every frame of that film by clustering the pixels. Okay, and then we're going to replace each pixel with some cluster representative. So you're going to compress the video by clustering all the pixels into some small set of quantized values. Okay, so you can do this in two ways. You can cluster each frame independently, so not do any sort of evolution, or you can cluster using an evolution model that says, well, the clusters from one frame are going to evolve into the clusters from another frame. Okay, so I don't know how well we're going to be able to see this, but if you just cluster individual frames, okay, you get a lot of flickering that happens you can see in the main character there. You can't see it very well here. It's a little dark. But essentially, here in the face, there's a lot of flickering because you're not enforcing any continuity of the clusters from frame to frame. Okay, but if we look at let's see if we can do this. Why is this not playing? Hold on. So this is the evolutionary model, and again, it's a little hard to see with the lights on, but you get actually a much smoother clustering and a much more visually appealing. Is this the right one? Sorry, this is. Well, okay. So you're going to have to take my word for it. You get a much smoother sort of look when you get to the evolutionary model. So just to wrap up here. So this is one of the techniques that I look at. It's something called small variance asymptotics. It's a way to build scalable algorithms for non-parametric data analysis. It marries ideas from a lot of different mathematical disciplines. I look at other problems as well in non-parametric data analysis, which I don't have time to talk about. But in general, I'm interested in how we can actually build the tools to perform rich data analysis on large data sets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. And now we have the last fourth talk in our panel from Michael Hasselmo, Professor of Psychological and Brain Sciences and also Associate Director of Center for Memory and Brain and Director of Computational Neurophysiology Laboratory in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Michael?
Thanks very much. So what I study is the brain, and the brain is a great problem for big data because the brain has a huge number of neurons in it. There's 100 billion neurons in the human brain. As I show here on the slide title, I'm actually studying mostly rodents, but even in rodents we have 200 million neurons that are potentially involved in the various behaviors the animals are expressing. So the question is, how do we understand this enormous number of neurons interacting to mediate behavior? So in my own laboratory, we have research going on at a number of different levels. We're not able to record all of these neurons simultaneously. We're in extracellular recording techniques. We can record up to 50 or so at a time. We also do intracellular recording and slice preparations from single neurons, one at a time. And we also do computational modeling, both of the potential mechanisms for the neural phenomena that we see, and also how for the understanding of how these individual interacting populations of neurons could mediate behavior. So in particular, we focus on memory function. Memory function is involved in a wide range of different behaviors. Your ability to remember what goes on here today will involve storing a lot of information in your episodic memory. You'll have a memory of coming here to a particular location on the 9th floor of the photonics building on a particular time on Friday morning, January 22nd. And you'll have a memory, hopefully, of a number of different things that you learned here, and you'll be able to remember this tomorrow or a couple of weeks from now. So that's the sort of information that you're storing in your episodic memory. And it's been shown that this episodic memory involves specific regions of the brain. So in the human, it's been shown that if you have bilateral damage to these particular areas, including an area called the hippocampus, as well as the entorhinal cortex, then you'll have impairments in your ability to remember episodes like this in the future. And so we've been studying these structures in the rat, looking at the activity of populations of neurons in these structures, trying to understand how it is that the interacting populations of neurons can mediate this episodic memory function. So that's it. The damage to these structures impairs episodic memory, and the particular neural responses that we've been focusing on are called grid cells as well as time cells. And these are respectively coding spatial location and the time of events. So how are we doing this? What we do, and these are the techniques that have been sort of the state of the art for the last couple of decades. We've been recording from what are called tetrodes. These are electrodes that are actually placed into the rat's brain and attached to the skull so that we can actually track the activity of neurons as the animals are actively exploring in the environment. And the tetrodes are able to record from multiple neurons simultaneously. So here's shows a tetrode with 4 different recording sites inserted in an area with a number of brain cells surrounding it. And these individual neurons, as you might know, they communicate via generating what are called action potentials, sometimes referred to as spikes. So here's a recording of the electrical membrane potential of a single neuron recorded in intracellular techniques. And you can see this neuron starts out at about -70 millivolts, and as you depolarize the cell, it generates these spikes, these sudden rapid changes that last about 1 millisecond. These are rapid changes in membrane potential, and those can propagate along the axons of the neurons to connect to other neurons and allow them to communicate. So it's this interaction of all these millions of neurons generating action potentials, causing action potentials in other neurons that really mediates everything that we're able to do on a day-to-day basis, and our understanding of the world and our ability to remember things about the world. So we can detect these spikes by recording extracellularly. These spikes are relatively large, intracellular, 100 millivolts, but when you look at them extracellularly, they're only about 100 microvolts. But you can see these rapid deflections in the electrical potential recorded at different tetrodes. And then you can actually isolate different neurons because you can, in a sense, triangulate. From one neuron here, we'll have a series of different shapes of potentials that are appearing on the different electrodes, whereas a different neuron at a different location would have different shapes of potentials. And these would cluster together. And so you just heard about clustering algorithms, and in fact, it's a major question in this field of how to get these clusters isolated independently. And it's quite amazing that despite efforts to make this a computational process, most laboratories still do it by hand, and it's the most time-consuming aspect of the process. It takes months for people to do the clustering of the individual neurons. So that's a major problem in the field. All right, so once you've identified these different neurons, you can then identify how they are coding the environment. So here's an example of a grid cell that we recorded in our laboratory. Here shows the way that we record these grid cells in the laboratory. You can see we have an open box here. These little red little dots here are LEDs mounted on the head of a rat as it's running around, and we're recording the activity of a single grid cell. You can see the same thing here schematically. The black line represents the movements of a rat as it's running around foraging in the environment, picking up little bits of crushed up Fruit Loops, which they love. And the red dot shows the location of the rat each time an individual grid cell fires a spike. And you can see that this single grid cell is coding the location of the rat in the environment. So it's firing at these locations that can be described as falling on the vertices of tightly packed equilateral triangles in a very regular pattern. So one of the things that we've studied, I should have mentioned actually, you may have heard about grid cells because the Nobel Prize in 2014 for physiology or medicine was awarded to Maybrit and Edvard Moser. This is a picture of me with them at a conference in England before they were awarded the Nobel Prize. So has received quite a bit of attention for potentially representing how we're coding the spatial location of individual memories. So one of the things that we've done is to try to understand the mechanism of generation of these grid cell responses. So in a science paper that was published in 2011, we showed grid cell firing characteristics associated with network theta rhythm oscillations in the entorhinal cortex. And then we blocked these theta rhythm oscillations by infusing a particular drug into a different structure. And we showed that with the loss of the theta rhythm oscillations, we lost this spatial coding of the neurons. And then when the theta rhythm oscillations returned, we could see the return of this spatial coding. So this supported a particular computational model that shows how changes in the frequency of these theta rhythm oscillations could be mediating the spatial coding of location by these neurons. So this is one of the computational questions that we've addressed. And we can look at how the change in theta rhythm oscillations corresponds with the gridness score for these neurons. And here's another interesting computational question. You can see very clearly by eye that if you do a two-dimensional autocorrelogram on the spatial firing pattern of these neurons, you get this very characteristic pattern of equilateral triangles or hexagonal pattern. And it's common to code the gridness of these neurons by taking a circle around a central firing field in the autocorrelogram and just looking for the rhythmicity, the kind of spatial periodicity of the firing of the neurons. But if you have an elliptical shape to the firing pattern, you won't get a very regular pattern. You have to actually adjust this, as we did in the science paper, to be more circular. But this is still an open question. It's very easy to see by eye the gridness of an individual neuron, but it's very hard to quantify that. Another thing we've worked on, and this relates to vision, these neurons are sensitive to the visual stimuli in the environment. So if you actually move the walls of the environment, some neurons will actually compress the location of their firing field. So here's in a 1 meter square environment, the cell is firing in locations that are about 40 centimeters apart from each other, but then if you move the walls of the environment, you actually get them closer to maybe around 25 centimeters from each other. Whereas other neurons won't change their location of firing, and we believe maybe these neurons are responding to stimuli on the ground plane of the environment, whereas these are responding to features on the walls. And this is an important question. How are the visual inputs influencing this spatial firing pattern. We've also looked at the firing of cells relative to theta rhythm oscillations. They will systematically change their phase of firing relative to the network theta rhythm oscillation. So you can plot this change of firing relative to spatial location, and you see systematic changes in firing phase based on spatial location, and you can even see that as the rat runs around in two-dimensional environments. You still get this phase specificity of firing. So the last thing I want to show you are examples of coding of time. You're in a single location now here, but you're able to remember events that happen at different points in time. These time cells might be mediating, contributing to this coding. You can see here we have a rat running in a single spatial location on a treadmill, and you can see these dots are representing different neurons firing at different time points. So the first that you saw, if you were watching closely, you would first see a violet dot representing cells that fire towards the beginning of time that it runs on the treadmill. And these are multiple runs on the treadmill, but the cell always fires at the same time point. Then the green dot showed the firing during the middle of the running, and the blue dot showed the firing towards the end of the running. So here it's going to come back and run on the treadmill. The cell coded by blue is also showing a place field here on a different location. But here you can see first there's this violet cell firing, and then you can see the cell coded by green is firing during the middle of the time period that it's running on the treadmill, and the cell firing coded by blue dot is towards the end of the period that it's running on the treadmill. And you can see the same thing for grid cells. It's interesting that the cells that code spatial location here, these are grid cells that are coding particular locations in the environment, but these same cells will also fire as time cells. So during the period of running, this cell actually is firing at the beginning of the running period and then stops and then fires near the middle and then stops and then fires near the end of the period of running on the treadmill. So that in a sense, the same cell may be coding both spatial location and the time of events on these particular, on this particular treadmill run. All right, so I tried to address the various questions that were raised by the organizers of the session here. And there's obviously a lot more detail in this slide that I can get into, but if we want to kind of get into some of the discussion of some of the details that we've been doing, both in terms of analyzing the data, but also using this computational modeling techniques to relate the firing characteristics of these neurons to the behavior of the animal. So I'll close there.
Thank you, Michael. So now we have time for questions from the audience to our panel. Before you ask a question, please introduce yourself. We'll have here a microphone around so you can be heard loudly. And please keep your questions fairly short so that we can have as many questions as possible and diversity of topics. Okay. Yes.
Azov Stavros, computer science. And this, I'm breaking the rules a bit. It's not a question. I just want to say something.
Okay.
So I think one of the reasons I thought this would be a great idea is, as you can see from these 4 talks, there are methods and there are applications. And it's really what I call them hammers and nails. And the question is to make sure that the hammers find the nails and vice versa. So I hope that today you really do that. I'm going to actually go to Jody because I think she brought a very good question, which is data science and big data. These two things, data science is not at all big data. So small data is also data science. So I just might make that point. And small data can lead to big data. Because you looked at only one picture. What about if I take all the art that's available? And every one of these provides a little bit of data. Wouldn't that be big data?
Is that my question? Yeah, I guess that would be big. Yeah, that would be big. But one of the things that I think is an interesting obstacle, at least in my field, and maybe I just am thinking in a very narrow way about it, is the fact that just even obtaining that information is incredibly challenging. And so there are, I think, built-in obstacles to making data in certain fields bigger data. It relies on a kind of collaborative outlook that many in at least my field don't have. We've been trained to think about our individual contribution rather than ways that we can actually team up, which obviously is a much more common phenomenon in the, at least even in the talks that we heard after mine, where I saw all the teams of researchers, and that is something you never see in my field. And so I think part of making or having that perspective that you have, Azar, on my field is also changing the behaviors of practice, at least within art history, to be collaborative, to think that crowdsourcing can be a reliable method, which is also something that we've been trained to have suspicion around, right? How can anybody know what we know, which is obviously a very flawed perspective, right? It's holding us back from making some of the connections that are much more natural for, I think, many of you to make. So I think a lot of it is also just behavioral and changing our perspective to relate to the whole vision panel. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Suchi Gopal from the Department of Earth and Environment. I had a question for Margaret about bats, because I worked with Tom Kunz on an NSF proposal. So when these bats come out of the caves, do you look at the sizes too? Because we were very interested in knowing the networks of bats, because we are trying to separate species in terms of do females hang out with females, and what's the pattern and what's the networking amongst the bats as they emerge out of these caves?
Yeah, so in these caves in Texas, we found that there are actually two species of bats. The Tadarda are the bats that live in these big maternity colonies where you have 1 million bats, and I showed the video of a Tadarda, but they're also Myotis, and we can distinguish them by the property of their flight behavior. So the Myotis are a little bit more maneuverable, the size might be slightly bigger, and so we can do some data analysis from their flight paths to distinguish them.
Just a question.
So Cheryl Grace from Mechanical Engineering, and I have a question about the crowd stuff that was just brought up by Jody but mentioned by Margaret. So how do you know when you go out to the crowd and you use information from them that you can trust it? Is there some other methods that you use?
Yeah, so there's a whole new discipline in computer science called human computation, where the human is considered a computational element that's part of a whole system. And the question is, how reliable is that component of the computation? So the trick, what you can do is you can actually do crowdsourcing studies that study the behavior of other crowd workers. And particularly for the biomedical images where we wanted to have really accurate annotations, what we did was we compared the annotations we got from postdocs here in biomedical engineering at Boston University and advanced PhD students, and compared them to what the crowd workers did. The crowd workers came actually pretty close. We were very pleased to have that comparison. And it turned out that when we went to these arbitrary images on the web, when there's, like, what did I show you? Penguins, bananas, and apples. When you ask crowd workers to draw the outlines of those, that's when you find people are not really taking it that seriously. And the annotations that the students did in my lab compared to the crowd workers were quite different. So it depends a little on the task. And when you show some crowd worker a cell image and you tell them, well, you know, these stem cells are really important for medical research, and you start talking about cancer research and all this, they actually do take it seriously and spend a lot more effort in it. But in terms of the data science, yeah, you can analyze this. You can use, have people annotate the same image over and over again until you really believe what's the right annotation.
Simon Streltsov, Long Short Way, BU grad. I wanted to continue this conversation about connection between art and computer science. I want to turn it around so we can use more from art experts, right? So a lot of computer science is about penguins and bananas. Well, our art approach is take a real expert and learn from him. right? So maybe we can take a real doctor annotating images, not just say putting labels, but putting more subtle things that he can find. Maybe you'll have less labeled data, but you'll have much more deep type of annotation and learn from that rather than just, hey, we can do crowdsourcing and find lots of trivial things. So I'm encouraging people to go deeper in finding more subtle things and learning from experts. And the other side of that is you have to learn from small data. You don't always have big data if you're looking for really interesting patterns.
That was the question, I think.
It was on, but it was not working. Irina Vodenska from Metropolitan College, working in complex systems in finance and economics. This is a question for Brian. I was intrigued by your algorithms on temporal evolution of clusters, and you were talking about the slow inference in the Dirichlet or dependent Dirichlet process. My question is whether you have any experience with using a supercomputer, and if yes, which one, or how that changes the time or the inference speed and obtaining the results of these time-dependent processes.
Yeah, so a lot of people in machine learning these days are becoming interested in how to take algorithms and apply them in, in distributed fashions on huge supercomputers, okay? And that's been done not so much by me, but by lots of other people. And the results are pretty amazing. I mean, you can analyze, for document collections, you can analyze tens or even hundreds of millions of documents per second if you can get your machine learning algorithm written over thousands of cores and working in a distributed fashion. So in my case, it's actually something we're interested in doing down the line, is taking the algorithms that we've developed for just single core machines and then scaling that up to more powerful machines.
Thank you. Valentin Baroshil of Physics Department. I also have a question to Brian. As we all know, an expert processes information different from a novice. For example, when you have to solve a problem in physics, students approach and professor approach the same problem differently, and the difference very often in clustering information, they cluster knowledge differently. Mm-hmm. So I believe that right now we have basically all technologies which would allow to kind of build a robot who can teach physics. Would you agree with that?
I don't know if I would agree with that. I think, what you're suggesting is that we have, so what we can do very well is we can build systems that are tailored to very specific tasks. If you look at Watson on Jeopardy, okay, Watson outperformed humans because it was able to look at a very small domain, which was doing text analysis. Things get much harder when you start to get fuzzier, and so right now at the edge of what's possible are things like, well, automated cars. We can that's essentially a solved problem, I would say. But I don't know. I don't know enough about the domain about having a machine teach physics, that seems like a fuzzier domain to me that would be a little bit difficult to do. You know, that said, the field is expanding rapidly, so maybe in 5 years this would be no problem. Yeah, that's
I want to say something about the teaching part also. I think there's a lot there for data science to do learning help, to do data analytics, to sort of keep track of how somebody is learning. So for example, learning a language, the vocabulary where you have trouble with, the computer can very easily just remember which words you have to repeat, and so I would see it as a positive thing where the computer can aid at this stage, and we don't want to just take over the world with automated things, but we can use automation to help us along.
All right, let's thank the speakers. Dino.
And our moderator, Professor Janusz Conrad. Again, round of applause. Thank you. We're going to take a quick coffee break before we come back to our next session. Just 5-10 minutes. Please help yourself to coffee and juice over on the side, and we'll herd you back when we get ready to go. Thank you.
Also, just a quick announcement for the next panel. I'd like to ask all the speakers when we resettle to sit at the front table from the beginning. That would help us out a lot. And also, when you come back, if there was an empty seat next to you, to please, if there's papers or your other belongings, to keep them with you, because we have many more registrants who will be coming in. Also, if you missed it, there is a coat room if you'd like to hang up your coat. Go straight out here to the end, and it's on the left. Thank you.
So what we ended up doing is we very simplified the problem. We just created two numbers. One